So, one of the things that I did not know when I was a kid and then going into adulthood was I did not understand that not everybody had my best interests at heart. And I feel like particularly for child victims of abuse, they are coming into the world without a recognition that other people are, I don't want to say dangerous, not on their side the way that they thought or were hoping they would be. Because when you're a child victim of abuse and you're dreaming of one day I'm not going to be surrounded by these abusers, one day I'm going to be out in the world and I'm going to get to experience the things that everybody else gets to experience. I'm going to have love and friendship and honestly, I feel like victims of abuse, child victims of abuse, really look at media and they're the books, the TV shows, the movies that they hold on to, hoping that this is what their future is going to be like or their relationships are going to be like. And as I've discussed in other videos, a lot of this media is wish fulfillment. It is not an accurate representation of reality. So when you go into the world very naively and damaged and hoping that other people are going to love you and treat you well, and you don't have a lot of defenses often, and you're getting mistreated by people, but you don't understand why, what was supposed to be an escape becomes just this horrifying Groundhog Day of abuse. And so, what I reporting to you live from the future adult relationship dynamics, what I had to learn was that not everybody who seemed interested in me was actually interested in me for my own benefit. So I would encounter people that would seem like they were friendly, a friend, that they cared about me, and they might even sit there and listen to me talk about like terrible things that had happened to me. And I thought that we were bonding. Side note, that's why I'm a firm believer we don't build friendships out of bonding over our shared trauma. I was telling people very personal things about me, vulnerable things about my past, and I was essentially handing them the keys to the kingdom of who I was and why I was the way I was and how I operated and how I ticked. And most people don't use that information for your benefit. They may not be actively nefarious, but they're going to be self-oriented often. So sometimes people would get a sense of like it would make them feel more secure about their identity. Dealing with me, dealing with people that are having a hard time or failing some way, can make that other person feel better about themselves, especially if they're giving advice. And so, you get to be magnanimous. You get to bolster your own self-esteem and your ego identity at someone else's expense, right? But the thing is, the problem with that is that, well, what happens when that person starts doing better? Then it becomes a threat to the other person's identity. If your identity is founded on other people being below you, in whatever hierarchy you've put together in your mind, if your identity is founded on other people being below you, not as good as you, not as successful, not being in a good place in the world, then when they start to do better and maybe even do better than you, that can cause anger or upsetness. And that person may not even be aware that they may not be aware consciously that that's what's happening. So you can have people who seem like they're supportive as long as you're doing poorly. And then as soon as you stop doing poorly, they're not supportive, they're not around, or suddenly they're really hypercritical when before maybe they were very supportive. You could also have people that basically are like investigative journalists about you and your life and what's happening, and particularly wanting you to go back and talk about the horrible things that have happened to you. So if you're like on a first date, bail, absolutely bail. You know what? First date, first time hanging out with people, potential friends, just no, that's going to be a no. Don't do it. Don't do it. So sometimes this kind of person is actively fishing for information, and the more information they get, the more information they know, the more they can manipulate you, essentially. So if they're not your parents who installed the buttons that are getting pushed, they learn what the buttons are. It's one thing when you've never met someone and they yell something out at you, maybe they call you an asshole or something, right? That doesn't hit, right? Like, you don't know me. What if it's your partner who's saying you're just like your father? You're just like your mother. Or we're bringing, let's say, some social justice dynamics into it. What a disaster. What a disaster. The more people know, the more accurate their criticisms. And I find victims of abuse are often thinking so objectively, so logically about a situation and not recognizing that the fact that someone's being critical, like hypercritical, not feedback, not helpful, constructive feedback, but just like hypercritical, they think that if they fix that thing, it means that then that person will feel differently about them or no longer think poorly of them, will change their opinion because, of course, they've changed whatever was wrong. The thing was, the criticisms just show you how they feel about you and then they're not giving you the benefit of the doubt. So, for example, someone could see you smiling, being happy, or being triumphant and think that you're smug. Or you could be a strong-minded person and someone could think that you're stubborn. You could be a feeling, emotional, sensitive person and someone could think you are overly sensitive and dramatic, right? The same thing can be interpreted two different ways. So when victims are in this like tug of war with an abuser over what objective reality is, and then they're showing you that voodoo doll, this is who you are, and then they attack the voodoo doll, you have to not allow that black magic to occur where you start to identify with the voodoo doll. Because maybe in some aspect you think, well, gosh, maybe I am being stubborn. Well, one person's stubborn is another person's, leader, right? Someone who knew what justice is and pursues it. So what the criticism, the hypercriticism, not the constructive criticism, what the hypercriticisms tell you is that this person does not have your best interest in mind. They're not looking at you with care and consideration, patience, love, kindness. They don't love you. They are never going to love you if you attempt to try and make them love you by fixing whatever is wrong. Because it's not about there being anything wrong with you. So I feel like, victims are going into the world and they end up in these abuse dynamics. And so much of it is founded on what the abuser thinks and is telling the victim of abuse what reality is. And it's really important to recognize that a lot of how they are so effective is because the more information they get, the more they can use against you. So this is why gray rocking is such an effective, short-term, effective tool to use with not safe people you're unsure about, someone who hasn't earned your trust, someone who's not demonstrated that they're on your side and that they think well of you. So gray rocking them, not giving them any information, not giving them any emotional response, reaction, or supply equals safety. And so this is actually the second take of a video because the first take I did, I was like, man, I told way too much personal information, which is literally the whole point of this particular video. But one thing that I did discover about my personal history. So I was watching a YouTube video like 2 nights ago and it was on the Kegos. And I had never heard of these people. And the video said, oh, they're like the most persecuted people in Western Europe for hundreds of years. And I'm sitting there thinking like, excuse me, what? I had never heard of these people. I'd heard of like the Jews, the Protestants, the Catholics, the Huguenots, the back and forth on certain religions and things, but I'd never heard of these people. And they weren't slaves, but they were a second class, second tier, subordinated class of citizens in kind of like the Spain French area. So, particularly in the Basque region, the Pyrenees Mountains, which is where my mom's side of the family is from. And they were treated essentially like lepers. So they were not allowed to walk in the center of, walk on a sidewalk. They had to walk in the center of the street. They couldn't touch things. They weren't allowed to work in a lot of different careers, crafts. So they basically were limited to like wood and rope making. So they'd be involved in cabinetry or building with wood, but they weren't allowed to touch anything because people thought that they were unclean somehow. So it's giving, you know, Jim Crow era South or the Dalits of India. They were treated, they were not allowed to go without shoes on, and their shoes were wood to prevent them from contaminating, you know, like church floor surfaces. They had to go into a sad second door, and they had their own little sad pool of the water. And so I was tripping because I had how is this? I've never heard about it in a show. I've never read it in a book. I've never had anyone educate it in a classroom. So I went to the internet. I was like, okay, Wikipedia, what is happening here? And it was all true. And in fact, this one Cago man had tried to go in the church door on the regular door, and they cut off his hand and nailed it to the door as a warning, like nobody else do this. So my family came over from the Pyrenees Mountains, from the Basque region of the Pyrenees Mountains. They went to the Canary Islands. They did like a year trip over the ocean, got to Veracruz, and then went up to San Antonio to basically settle. And there was a fort there, and they basically turned the fort into the town of San Antonio. And I always thought that was kind of weird because through all of the stories of my family, no one ever explained like we didn't have money, we were leaving because of, you know, famine or hardship or economic reasons. It didn't make sense. And in fact, my mom was talking about, well, anyway, so I was sitting there and I was like, well, who would make this trip? And in fact, they took the year trip on the boat, and the King of Spain was like, actually, y'all, I've changed my mind. You should come back. And they said, absolutely not. We're not getting back on the boat. And they walked. They walked from Veracruz all the way up to San Antonio. And this is like the late 1720s, 1731. So in the French Revolution, which is like 1780 something, during the French Revolution, all of these Cagos all across wherever they lived, they busted into the churches, found the records of everybody's like bloodline lineage that the church was apparently keeping track of, and they fucking burned it right into the fire. They basically went, this ends here, and if they don't know, then they can't subjugate us anymore. So they went from being one of the most persecuted secondary class citizens in all of Western Europe to suddenly completely disappeared. And not only did the records disappear, but apparently all of the Cago descendants basically told nobody. They did not pass this information on to their kids. Nobody has any idea. And because they didn't look any different, there was nothing visibly marking them as separate from the society they were in, that they were able to blend into society and essentially disappear. And so I was sitting there like, did we do that? Is that a thing that happened? Would I be living this horribly second class citizen kind of life if I grew up in a different place in a different time period, and we just happened to come to well, I mean, it wasn't America at the time. I would say I'm Texican because, you know, San Antonio went back and forth from being Mexico to America to Mexico. Anyway, so when we are talking to people and we're giving people our personal information, our background information, our stories, and we're telling them who we are, it's only safe to do that with people who actually are going to look at us from a position of of giving us the benefit of the doubt, of actually liking us as human beings. When you give somebody who doesn't like you more information about you, they use it and weaponize it against you, whether it's a random person on the internet or if it's someone that you think is trying to be a friend to you. The way you can tell whether or not someone has good intentions towards you is whether or not they're fair with you, whether or not they're being hypercritical, whether or not they switch to the next criticism no matter how much you fix. Someone who those criticisms may not even be valid in the first place. They may not be something that somebody else would think is a problem. Not everything that's I don't want to say flaw, but not everything that's a quirk is necessarily a bad thing. For some people, they're going to love it, and some people are not going to like it. We're all individual human beings, and for the most part, as long as someone isn't being unsafe, we get to be quirky and maybe a little weird, or maybe not weird. Maybe we're like vanilla. Whatever the thing is, somebody, you want to filter for people who actually like you before you even filter for trying to fix yourself and thinking about what's wrong with you. Because at the end of the day, think about it. When you love another person, don't you give them so much grace? Don't you understand? Aren't you very compassionate about when they do something wrong and make a mistake? I mean, victims so often have so much compassion and empathy, and the abuser has so little. So when you put yourself into that position of thinking, how is the abuser talking to me? How do they look at me? That's one of the ways that we can recognize that this person does not actually even like us. Anyway, I hope this makes sense, and I'll talk to you next time.